Hello and welcome back. In this episode we're going to take a look at the Floating Action Button widget, which is the ideal widget to use for any call to actions that you may have in your application. You'll notice our homepage contains a scaffold with an app bar, and what we're going to do inside the body of the scaffold is create a new Floating Action Button. You'll notice by the squiggle there in our IDE that the onPressed parameter is required. We can simply specify the onPressed parameter to be an empty function for now. And the child of the Floating Action Button is going to be a home icon for the purposes of this demonstration. You'll notice there in the top left of our scaffold body we have a Floating Action Button with a home icon. Now you'll notice upon pressing the Floating Action Button that we get the expected splash animation. However, if we were to disable the Floating Action Button by setting the onPressed to none, you'll notice that pressing the button will no longer display that splash animation. However, it should be noted importantly that the colour and style of the Floating Action Button doesn't change. This is different to some of the other buttons, such as the raised button, flat button, and outline button, to name a few, which will change their colour, the colour of the button and the colour of the text, if the button becomes disabled. It's therefore recommended, if the Floating Action Button becomes disabled, to manually change the colour of the Floating Action Button using either the foreground and or the background colour properties of the Floating Action Button. You'll notice there are also a number of other properties that you can change, such as the other colours, the elevation of the button, the elevation when the button is disabled. You can also specify whether the Floating Action Button is mini or not. You can specify the shape, the clip behaviour, whether the button should be autofocused or not, and whether the Floating Action Button is extended. Essentially, when the action button is extended, it becomes more of a rounded, rectangular shape. We'll demonstrate that now using the specifically named extended constructor of the Floating Action Button class. First of all though, we'll just change that onPressed back to an empty function to re-enable the button, and then you'll notice how we can use this extended named constructor to create an extended Floating Action Button automatically. Rather than taking in a child, the extended constructor takes in an icon and a label. For example, we can specify an icon once again of the home variety, like so, and we can then also specify the label to be a text widget with the text home. You'll notice there how the width of the Floating Action Button expands, becoming more rectangular with these rounded corners. That essentially is the main difference between an extended Floating Action Button and a default Floating Action Button. The default Floating Action Button being a circle with generally a single icon as the child, whereas the extended Floating Action Button allows you to specify both an icon and a textual label. Now, the other thing to note, if you are creating a Floating Action Button and you only have one Floating Action Button on the page, is rather than using the body of the scaffold, you can use the specific Floating Action Button parameter of the scaffold widget. You'll notice I can change the body property to Floating Action Button property. And this will automatically align the Floating Action Button by default in the bottom right hand corner of the scaffold. This means also that the Floating Action Button will remain fixed in that bottom right hand corner and will be placed above any other content in the body that will sit behind the Floating Action Button. So there you go, the Floating Action Button, the ideal widget for any and all of your application's call to actions. I hope you found this useful. Thank you very much for watching.